Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming today. We have Andrew Bridgen here tonight, as you well know, one of the most principled chaps I've ever come across, to be fair. Here. And I'm absolutely delighted to have been the person who tried to get this together. Thank you so much to Troy and to Taunton Racecourse for hosting us. It's going to be a great evening. A little bit of housekeeping. If the fire alarm goes off, we haven't planned any kind of practice run, so please leave the building, and the meeting point is in the sort of centre of the concourse. Move as fast as you can, I know, but everyone does it better. Try not to get hurt. I've seen Andrew speak once before and it was a bit mind-blowing, so I think it's going to be very much the same this evening. And thank you so much all for coming, and hopefully you'll enjoy it.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this fantastic venue of Taunton Racecourse. It's actually the second racecourse I've spoken at today, and they're the only two racecourses I've ever spoken at. But Exeter this morning for the Great Resist, I made a cameo appearance, and now this afternoon, or this early evening, we're in Taunton. I'm going to speak for a while. I'll show you a few videos that I've made that demonstrate a few things. We will have a break at 7:30, and afterwards I'll do a bit more speaking after the break, and then we'll have a Q&A session where you can ask me any questions you like, and I will answer them to the best of my ability. So my name's Andrew Bridgen, and between 2010 and 2024, for over 14 years, I was the Member of Parliament for North West Leicestershire. And I'm going to tell you a bit of my story and how I came to wake up to what's going on in government, in our country and across the world, and how I came to those conclusions. And I was brought up into quite a poor family, so I was looked after by my maternal grandmother until I was 6 years old, in Tamworth in Staffordshire, and then I went back to my mum and dad, and they got a small holding in South Derbyshire, right on the Leicestershire border. It's hard to believe, but we didn't have mains electricity until I was 11 years old. I went to the local village school, and I went to the Pingle Swaddling Coat, just over the border in South Derbyshire from Leicestershire, a comprehensive school, and a very comprehensive education it was. I actually won my first election at Pingle School when I was at the age of 16. I was voted head boy of school. The main job of the head boy was to manage the school at lunch times, because the teachers all used to go to the pub. And my main job with my prefects was to make sure that the rest of the pupils didn't burn the school down. I mean, I was fairly successful. Obviously, I couldn't save the whole school, but we managed to protect most of it, most of the time. And it's interesting that about 4 years after I was there, they did burn the whole of the school down. I can remember when I was first elected to Parliament, within the first few months, above Strangers Bar, for anyone who's been in Parliament, there's a rather nice room called the smoking room, where you can drink but you can't smoke, but it's still called the smoking room. It's got lots of settees in there, you know, the leather settees, the Chesterfield suites, and there's a waiter that comes and brings your drinks orders and everything. And there's a guy there called Hugo Swire. He was one of Cameron's chums. They all went to Eton and Oxford. Are there any public school educated people in here today? You won't admit it, will you? Not many. Okay. And obviously they all went to Oxford, to Eton and to Oxford. And I remember Hugo Swire, it turned round to me in the smoking room a few months after I was elected, and he said, "And Andrew, what sort of school did you go to? Which school did you go to? And he knew darn well. So I said, well, Hugo, I went to the sort of school where if you'd gone there, you would have spent most of your time with your head forced down the toilet. It was a comprehensive school, and it was a very comprehensive education. And it also means that my first sexual experience was consensual and with a member of the opposite sex, unlike you. And he never spoke to me for 2 years. He ran off. He never spoke to me for 2 years, and I didn't mind. So I did my A-levels at the Pingle, and then I went to Nottingham University. I went to Nottingham because I'm a country boy at heart. I love the countryside, and when I went around Nottingham University, it's got 360 acres of campus, and it wasn't overbuilt. It had got Woollerton Park next door, so although it was in the city of Nottingham, it was really rural, it was really green, and I had a very happy 3 years there. And mysteriously, only because I was interested in the topics, I chose to do my degree at Nottingham University a long time ago in biological sciences with biochemistry, and I specialised in genetics, virology and behaviour. Those topics would come back to be quite prescient later on in my life. After Nottingham University, I joined the Royal Marine Commandos down here in the West Country, down in Devon. I had a few injury problems, and my mother rang me up and said, your dad's had an accident and he's broken his hip. He's 48 years old. There's no one to look after the family. You'll have to come back and look after the family. So I went and looked after the family. Set a business up with £1,000 called AB Produce PLC in 1988. Built it up, and 22 years later it was turning over £30 million, employing 300 people, and I'd relocated it just over the border into northwest Leicestershire, spent £10 million building a new factory, putting the new equipment in. We were the best doing what we did, which was packaging, washing packaging, and then also peeling potatoes and other vegetables. I was voted Young Executive of the Year UK in the year 2000 when I was young. Happy days. And I was also chairman of the Institute of Directors for the East Midlands in the late 90s, and I was on the council of the IOD, which have got those lovely premises on Pall Mall at 116 Pall Mall. And I got to meet all of the new Labour ministers, the small business ministers and the business ministers and everything. And you have an opinion of politicians that they're sort of something a bit special and perhaps the brightest and best of us, there for the national good, to deliver for the people. Well, it's a bit of an awakening when you actually meet them, unfortunately. And it was clear, these were not the quality of people I thought they were going to be. So I first of all got involved in politics a little bit. In the late 90s, I was very prominent in the campaign to keep us out of joining the euro. So I was Business for Sterling and the No campaign, and those went pretty well. We achieved our aims, and we got round to 2005 election. I remember I personally gave a lump of money to the Conservative Party, thinking that was the best chance we had of getting rid of Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. And I think the Conservatives had a 0.5% swing in that election, and I worked at that out from my donation. If my donation was responsible for that, I'd got to give something like £10 million to get them out, and I realised it wasn't going to happen very quickly. And I used to go to a pub locally, and I had a circle of friends, and a lot of them were small and medium-sized business owners, and we used to go and have a few beers, and then the conversation generally turned around to the state of the nation and the state of the government and the state of the local area of North West Leicestershire, which had been under Labour control. The council had been under Labour control pretty much constantly since 1983 when it had been formed. It was the most deprived constituency in Leicestershire, Colville, a gritty ex-mining town, was the most deprived town in Leicestershire, and nothing was happening. And my friends used to moan every Friday night about how bad it all was, and in the end, I must have had 1 pint of Marston's pedigree too many. I think I often had 1 pint of Marston's pedigree too many, and I said, I've just had enough of this. Every Friday we come to the pub, and every Friday it's the same story. You're moaning, you're all moaning about the same things. No one's going to sort it for us. We're going to have to do it ourselves. I said, look, so if you all stand for the local council, the district council, and I stand for MP, and we all get in, we can take over the area, and then we can do it. And I think they must have had a pint of Marston's pedigree or something too much, because they all said yes. I said, look, I'll put the money up for the leaflets and everything, and we'll take it from there. And they all said yes. So I think the local Conservative Association in North West Leicestershire, they'd probably only got about 55 members. I don't think they'd put a leaflet out in 10 years. And they'd never put a full slate of candidates for a local election. So we sort of had an influx. I went and actually did some exams. You have to do exams to get onto the Conservative candidates list. Believe it or not, you have to pass an exam. And 75% of people don't pass it. But we got through that, and we'd taken over in North West Leicestershire. 2007, the local elections. The Labour Party was so confident. They even put council tax up 8% in the election year. They always put council tax up, every year. And they put it up by 8%. They were so confident that, but we shocked them, because we actually delivered leaflets, went and spoke to people, had credible candidates with roots in the community, people who wanted to make a real difference. And we had the biggest swing against the Labour Party in North West Leicestershire in 2007 in the country. And we took Labour from control since 1983 in one night in a 12-month campaign down to 5 councillors. There were a few bits and bobs in there, but we had a massive majority. I think we had 26 councillors out of 38. We took over, and what I can tell you is, working with my council, it took 12 years, till 2019, we had turned the poorest constituency in Leicestershire into the richest. By 2019, working with the council, and bear in mind, I told you I built a factory in North West Leicestershire, and I was on the East Midlands Regional Assembly. And the East Midlands Regional Assembly, I was a business member, they said to me, you're building your factory in the least business-friendly constituency, planning area, of the whole of the East Midlands. I remembered that, and it was true. I was spending £10 million in the constituency, creating 300 jobs. You'd have thought I was bringing bubonic plague into the constituency, the way I was treated by the planning department. Well, karma's a thing. So when we won the elections, we sacked the planning department. There was a bit of re-education. You know, we had consultants in to train them, teach, and we had a 2-day course on treating the public as the customer. The worst offenders in the planning department didn't even turn up for the course. They took the time off sick. They were sacked. And at the end, when you have the feedback session from these civil servants who work for you and are paid for by you, they said things like, well, the course is all well and good, but why do we have to treat them like the customer? Because they can't go anywhere else. And that was the attitude. And I do believe that the previous Labour regime, and it's not saying that it's not across all parties now, they were so corrupt that the rumour was that they were taking a 2% cut off the build cost of everything that was built in North West Leicestershire. So you've got architects and building firms who wouldn't even apply for planning permission in North West Leicestershire. So what that actually meant is the whole area hadn't developed for many, many years because people just wouldn't come because of the extra problems trying to build anything, houses, factories in northwest Leicestershire. But that also meant that northwest Leicestershire was a bit of a fallow field. It hadn't been tended very well. Northwest Leicestershire is the centre of population of the UK. Ashby-de-la-Zouch is in northwest Leicestershire. It's the furthest town from the sea in any direction, which isn't very far, it's about 70 miles, but there you go, 70 miles. We're also the centre of population in that if everybody in the UK had to walk somewhere, on an average walk the shortest distance and meet up, you would be in Appleby Magna, which is at the bottom end, it's just in northwest Leicestershire. It's very well served by roads. We've got the M1, the M42, we've got the A50. So we've got north, south, east, west roads. We've also got East Midlands Airport, which is the biggest dedicated cargo handling airport in the UK, so in the middle of the country. So if you want to have a big shed and distribute anything, or manufacture and distribute anything around the UK, northwest Leicestershire is where you need to be. Because from northwest Leicestershire, 4 hours lorry drive and 4 hours lorry drive back, so in a working day at least, you can hit 84% of all the chimney pots in Great Britain. So, with a different attitude from the council, pro-business, pro-development, playing to our strengths of distribution and logistics, by 2019, so some 12 years after we'd taken control of the council, Northwest Leicestershire, we got to the point where there's 1.2 jobs in the constituency for everyone of working age. So we're a massive importer of people who have to travel into the area to work. You may have known that council's got to retain business rates for quite a number of years. We built that many new, fantastic distribution centres and developments and factories that Northwest Leicestershire was retaining twice as much business rates in value as any other constituency in the country. We were delivering the highest economic growth in the country and had done consistently. And I'd sussed out that what people wanted, most people, they're not asking for a lot. People in Northwest Leicestershire, they wanted to get a job that paid decent wages locally, be able to afford to buy a house locally with their wages, pay the bills, go out on a Saturday night and go on holiday for a couple of weeks in the summer, hopefully from East Midlands Airport. I don't think that's asking too much, and in Northwest Leicestershire we delivered it. We delivered consistently the highest economic growth from a low base, but we were delivering the highest growth in economics. We delivered the jobs growth. By 2019, Northwest Leicestershire was the only part of Leicestershire where household incomes were above the UK national average. And because we built enough houses, we built about 800 houses a year and we won awards for them, the Building Beautiful project, we developed that in Northwest Leicestershire 12 years before the government adopted it, and we've been building good quality built infrastructure. And because we'd built enough good quality houses, we kept the house prices in Northwest Leicestershire 30% below the UK average. Well, above average UK incomes, 30% below housing costs, that's the sweet spot, which leaves enough people more money, more freedom, more choices. My definition of poverty has always been money, and I've been very poor, I've been very rich, and now I'm very poor again, but that's life. But wealth does not buy you friends, happiness or health. All it buys you is choices. And the real definition of poverty are people who have no choices. And I think there's many analogies with what's being done to our nation now, where effectively choices are being reduced. And one way of reducing people's choices is to take more money off you in taxes. And that's inexorably what's been going on under different governments. I'll also point out that Northwest Leicestershire District Council now hold the record. They hold the record for the longest ever council tax freeze in the UK. That from the moment we took over in 2007 until a couple of years ago, never put the council tax up in 15 years because we earned enough money off the retained business rates and the new homes bonus to deliver everything. So I wasn't surprised that very handily, just before the 2019 election, you'll remember that David Cameron brought in something called the Happiness Index, where the ONS do various checks and they find out where the happiest place. And North West Leicestershire, unsurprisingly, was the happiest place to live in the Midlands. Not bad for a place that had been the most deprived town in Colville in the whole of Leicestershire. And what's worse is that in 2008, so we'd already won the council with the biggest swing in the country. David Cameron, as leader of the opposition, had come to my seat before I won the 2010 election. And in front of constituents, not as many were at the meeting as are here tonight, but he told me in front of the constituents that the area I was hoping to represent was a dump, and that the Conservative Party wouldn't be giving me any money because it was unwinnable. And I don't know if he thought I was some sort of parachuted in candidate from somewhere else. I pointed out to him that Colville was on my postcode. It's actually where I live now, and he said, well, I went there in 2005 with Michael Howard. What a dump! And in front of people who came from Colville. He wasn't really keen on me getting in. I got the impression. So in front of my constituents, I told the then leader of the opposition, soon to be Prime Minister, David Cameron, that the best thing he could do is never ever come to North West Leicestershire again, and that I would win it, and I didn't need his money, the party's money. And one thing about David Cameron, he can sometimes keep his word, because he never came to North West Leicestershire ever again. And I think we were all happy with that. So the 2019 election, in 2010, despite Cameron telling me I wasn't going to win no money, I had the second biggest swing in the country against the Labour Party in that election, turning a 4,500 unbeatable, apparently, Labour majority into 7,500 Conservative majority. In 2015, I put that majority up to 11,200. 2017, despite Theresa May's very, very best efforts with the granny tax to destroy the Conservative Party, I put my majority up to 13,300. I'd led the Leave in the East Midlands at the Brexit referendum, and I can tell you on that one, Boris Johnson, I went to see Boris Johnson and said, are you going to be a Remainer or a Leaver? And Boris was unequivocally, he wasn't bothered either way. I think he just looked at what was the political advantage for him, and he could see, obviously, inadvisably, because he's not a great politician, not a great human being, David Cameron, but he was obviously decided he was going to lead, which he thought was at no political cost, the Remain campaign, and it was going to win. That's why David Cameron was leading it. He'd been told, you're definitely going to win, and so you lead it. Well, obviously Boris, he likes the limelight. He wasn't going to eclipse Cameron. Cameron wasn't going to let him take centre stage on the Remain campaign. The only room for anyone to have a stage was on the Leave campaign. So Boris became a Leaver because it was politically better for him to promote himself by being on the Leave side, because there was more space. The day before the referendum, and I was leading the Leave campaign for the East Midlands, so I was up against Ken Clarke, the arch Remainer, also a Bilderberg member, and I got a call from Vote Leave headquarters. I mean, Cummings is a strange guy. A very strange guy. I think we'll leave that one there. And they said, we're sending Boris up to you. It's eve of poll before the referendum. We're sending Boris up to North West Leicestershire. What do you want to do with him? And I said, well, we'll go and take a walk around Ashby to Lazouche, nice market town. And of course, we had all the film crews came up, Sky, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, day before the referendum. They were all there, and it was going to be good. And also, we were making a documentary, and I think we were making a documentary called, I think, Brexit, A Very British Coup. or Brexit. Yeah, Brexit, a very British coup, the first one. The next one was Brexit means Brexit. But we were mic'd up with radio mics, a bit like this probably. And Boris had got one on. And we went for a private chat, we thought. And we did a Gordon Brown and we hadn't taken the mics off, you see. And we were 50 metres from the cameras. We thought, well, and I said, I told Boris, you do realise we're definitely going to win the referendum tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, you should have seen his face when I told him that. And he argued with me and told me, no, we weren't. It'll be close, but we're not going to win. And I said, well, I don't know how many doors you've knocked on, Boris, but I mean, we are going to win. And I always knew we were going to win, because I knew that people who didn't normally vote were going to come out and vote. And I don't know if you know how the polling works, but I mean, you know, YouGov, people who are interested in politics sign up to YouGov, and they poll them. Well, I mean, people who don't vote, they're not engaged in politics. They're not signed up to the YouGov panel. These are people who are missing from the survey. And when Ipsos, Mori or whoever ring up Mr. Smith from Colville, they're going to say, how are you going to vote in the referendum? And he's going to say, I'm going to vote to leave. Mr. Smith, did you vote in the last general election? No. Did you vote in the local elections? No. Did you vote in the previous general election? No. Well, they're going to put Mr. Smith down at zero chance of voting. So although he said he's voting leave, they don't believe him because he's got no history of voting. And I actually thought these people were going to come out and vote. And they weren't going to come out and vote for the status quo. They were voting for a change. And on referendum night, North West Leicestershire is normally a fairly high turnout area. Not so much at the last election. But I think it turned out 70% to get me in 2010, and then as the majority got bigger, it went down and down and down. Well, when I saw the turnout for North West Leicestershire for the referendum, 79.8%. I was confident. I knew that was going to happen, and I knew I'd spent the last 3 months before the referendum. It was no good going to the villages of North West Leicestershire or Leicestershire or Derbyshire or Lincolnshire, because they are turning out at 80+% anyway. But you know, on the council estates, where they're down at 50 and 40% turnout, there's low-hanging fruit if you can get those people to turn out and vote on, and they did. Poor old Ken Clark, you know, that big beast of the Conservative Party was my opponent. Yeah. The only constituency in the whole of the East Midlands that voted Remain was Rushcliffe. That was his seat. Otherwise, he'd have had no votes at all. It wasn't close, and the establishment didn't want us to leave. It was all part of the pantomime of elections. But we had the Get Brexit Done election in 19. I'm on a bit of a high. North West Leicestershire voted 61% leave, by the way. The East Midlands voted 59% leave. It wasn't close, as I predicted to Boris it wouldn't be. And that 19 election, my majority had been sitting at 13,300. There were 6 candidates on the ballot paper. I got 63% of all the votes. Happiest place to live in the Midlands, highest economic growth in the country. And the BBC, I remember being up all night and the BBC interviewed me the next morning, and I was being a bit flippant really. We're going out live to the nation. Mr. Bridgen, you must be delighted. You've just been returned again for the 4th time in North West Leicestershire with a larger majority. Every election your majority's gone up, your vote's gone up, your vote share's gone up. You must be delighted. What have you got to say to the nation? And I said, it's terrible. He said, why? I said, well, I've delivered the highest economic growth, 1.2 jobs for everyone of working age, the happiest place to live in the Midlands. I said, and 1 in 3 of the people are still not voting for me. Obviously, I've got to work much harder to impress them. And the BBC hated that going out, but that did go out live on election morning, isn't it? That's what happens when you haven't had enough sleep, you see. And of course, that was brilliant, and I'm really happy. The area's really happy, and And then unfortunately, 6 weeks later, the whole world descends into madness with the COVID debacle. Now, we should have known about this, because when I was first elected in 2010, MPs have surgeries where we book into a village hall or a venue like this, and people come and see you and tell you their problems. And very early on, only a few months after I was first elected in 2010, an elderly couple, I thought they were an elderly couple, they were about 10 years older than me, completely broken, distraught, Mr. and Mrs. Rudkin came to see me. And Mr. and Mrs. Rudkin came to see me and told me a story which was unbelievable. A story would definitely be a conspiracy theory about how they'd been wrongly convicted of fraud by the post office due to a dodgy computer system. And Mr. Rudkin's story was unbelievable. But I looked at Mr. and Mrs. Rudkin. They were convicted criminals. There's nothing I could do about it. And it was clearly upsetting them telling me their story. And I looked at them and I thought, why would you put yourself through this? It's clearly really, really disturbing for you to talk about it. There's nothing I can do about it. Why would you put yourself through this if it wasn't true? And I'll tell you the story that Mr. Rudkin told me. And see what you would have made of all of this. And he said that he'd been running the post office in Ibstock in northwest Leicestershire. Ibstock, where all the good bricks come from, two of the biggest brick factories in the UK. And he was chuffed to bits because all the sub-postmasters in the UK had voted him to be their representative. So he became the chair of the Post Office Federation for the whole of the UK, and he was going to negotiate on behalf of your lovely sub-postmasters with the post office and other stakeholders. And he was very pleased that he'd got this as a recognition of how he'd worked hard at his post office in my constituency in Ibstock. And he said, and that was great. And he said, and part of his duties, he said he got invited to go to a company called Fujitsu, who administered and developed the Horizon software system, which is the accounting system that all the sub-postmasters in the UK have to use. It's given to them by the post office. And as the representative for all the sub-postmasters, he went down to Fujitsu's headquarters, which are apparently at Bracknell, and he went to this building, parked up, went to the building, and he said they were showing him all round their headquarters and everything as a VIP guest, and he said, Andrew, I think they mistook me for someone else. He said, because they showed me everywhere. He said, and then they took me downstairs into what they called the boiler room, and he said, I saw all these computers and these computer engineers tapping away, and he said, I couldn't help but notice on the screen they were running Horizon. And I got chatting with them, and he said, what's going on here? And they said, we're sorting all the problems out, all the glitches. And he said, oh, right. He said, I've got a dodgy currency transaction here. This has gone wrong. I'll have to sort that out here. And I said, well, yeah, but you can't do that without the sub-postmasters knowing, can you? And they said, oh, no, we don't. We do it just covertly. We just sort all these problems out. And obviously, he said that his members had been prosecuted, and always on the evidence of the post office that no one could remotely access those computers in sub-postmasters' post offices without them knowing about it. And so therefore, and the system hadn't got any glitches in it. It was Rolls-Royce, and so that any losses had got to be down to the sub-postmaster, and that was deeply worrying. He says, and then Mr. Rudkin said, then I think they realised who I was. He said, and they threw me out the building. So he went and got back in his car, and he drove back up to Leicestershire, got back home late, and was thinking about what he'd seen, and went to bed with his good lady, He said before they'd even got out of bed in the morning, the next morning, there was a massive bang at the door, and it was Post Office Inspectorate, and they were shouting up to his bedroom window, "You're £44,000 short overnight and you're going to be prosecuted." Now, do you think, if you're told this story, which sounds unbelievable, because there's no way that, you know, having Mr. Rudkin, having inadvertently in 2008 uncovered the fact that all those sub-postmasters have gone to prison on unsafe charges, biggest miscarriage of justice in UK history, and then the very next morning after that strange incident had happened, he was accused of being £44,000 short overnight on his computer, and they were arrested, and the post office would try and take his house off him to pay the 44,000 back. And I listened to Mr. Rudkin, and I couldn't help but feel, you know, he was telling me the truth, as unbelievable as it was, a government conspiracy. So I went into Parliament and said to a few MPs, and not just Conservative MPs, I went round a lot of MPs and said, have you had people who've been a pillar of society and like got a 30-year record of running a post office, never had any problems, and all of a sudden they've been done for fraud, defrauding the post office of lots of money and got criminal records and everything? And mysteriously, 4 or 5 people said they had. So we got a little group, called it the Post Office Reform Group, and we interviewed the post office. Well, we interviewed the sub-postmasters first, and then we interviewed the post office. We invited them in. And the difference between those two groups, the post office were really grateful, the sub-postmasters were really grateful for anyone to listen to their grievances and their concerns. And then we had that Paula Venables woman who was running the post office coming in to see us. There's only 5 MPs, and she always came in with 2 lawyers either side of her, very, very aggressive lawyers, and she wasn't very keen on answering any questions. Bear in mind that you own the post office. It's a government. It's owned. All government owns all the shares. It's run by the business department in government. It's a sort of standalone business, but we own it. And of course, the post office maintained that their system was a Rolls-Royce system with no glitches, and that was brilliant because I managed to ambush Paula Venables, and she said the system's perfect and anyone could test it and it's fine. So I said, okay, let us put some forensic accountants in to test the system then. And she couldn't back out. And I managed to get the government not to take one of the big 4 accountancy firms, people who could have been influenced by the offer of future contracts. I got the government to take on someone who was recommended to me, a boutique forensic accountant company called Second Sight, who you've never heard of. That's because they only ever work for big banks, and they track down when bank employees rob tens of millions of pounds out of the bank, which we never hear about. And all they do is find out how they've done it, try and get the money back, but the most important thing is making sure no one can ever use that method of defrauding the bank again. The guy's name was Ron Warmington. I'd met him, he's a really decent guy. It was probably going to be the last job he ever did before he retired, and I knew he'd do a good job. And I managed to get the government to take him on, as his firm on, as the auditors for the Horizon system. But what I failed to do is I told Oliver Letwin, and that's quite interesting. Oliver Letwin was one of the 5 MPs in the review group. He was Secretary of State for the Cabinet Office. That means he ran all the civil service, very powerful position, and he's also the political advisor to David Cameron. So I knew that David Cameron knew everything that was going on in that little group of 5 MPs. In fact, I think that's why Oliver Letwin was there. And it took me time afterwards to realise why, you know, a system that had been brought in by the Labour Party was continued by the Conservatives, why nothing had changed and no one wanted to expose all these problems which were legitimate. You have to remember the government were trying to sell the post office off, weren't they? There weren't any problems like some pesky people have gone to prison who shouldn't have done, and there might be a liability. You didn't want any of that. You just sell it. Sell it. So, looking back now, that's what happened. Well, I failed to get Oliver Letwin to agree to. I said the Cabinet Office have got to pay for the investigation, and he said no, the Post Office are going to pay for their own investigation. I said, well, what's going to happen then is, as soon as Ron and his team start finding anything that's wrong, the Post Office are going to clamp down on him, and it's going to be a disaster. No, they're going to pay. And of course, that's exactly as I predicted to the government, exactly what happened. Within 3 months, Ron and his team were finding problems with the Horizon system, glitches, all sorts of bugs, and the reports coming back to us from his investigation were being redacted by the Post Office before we saw them. Whatever government would never redact anything, would they? And in the end, Ron Warmington leaked the unredacted reports to me and to James Arbuthnot, another MP at the time. And of course the Post Office threatened him personally with civil prosecution for breach of contract because they were paying him. But fortunately then a Fujitsu whistleblower came forward and told the government, told Ron's team that everything Mr. Rudkin had said was true. It was interesting that when I first wrote to Fujitsu on behalf of Mr. Rudkin as his MP, and said that he's been to your premises on this date, he claims he's been to this premise and this is what happened, he said he'd never been on the premises. And then I said, well, I wrote back to them and said, Mr. Rudkin says he signed the visitors book. And they said, we've lost the visitors book on that day. So, I mean, it was just a cover-up of it, and nothing was believable. But by 2014, we knew everything. Got everything, and I went to every single media outlet in 2014 I knew, and in Parliament it's called the lobby, they're all there. BBC, permanently in Parliament whenever it's sitting, and in fact they're there when it's in recess as well. You've got your lobby journalists, the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, everything, and every newspaper and lots of the online stuff now, they're all there permanently based in Parliament. And I went to them all and said, look, you run this story. This is the biggest miscarriage in history in UK so far. You run this story, you'll get an award. You will get an award. And nobody could run the story. And that is very analogous to what happened when I started talking about vaccine harms and vaccine deaths. Exactly the same journalists. They're not interested. They weren't interested at all of running a story which would be the biggest story across the world. Well, the only thing that stimulated the debate on the Post Office Horizon system was in January 24, when ITV produced a documentary called Mr. Bates and the Post Office. What I can tell you is that everything that was in that documentary, I said in Parliament 10 years before, but no one had taken any difference. And even that ITV documentary is not the full story, because that in itself is a cover-up. So I made a little documentary about it, which I'm going to play you now, which will tell you the truth about the Post Office.
The Post Office told every single one of us sat here today, told us over and over, you're the only one.
The ITV drama, Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, has rightly provoked a storm of outrage. And it's a storm that's long overdue.
Look at us. Here we all are.
I became aware of this injustice in 2010, shortly after I was elected.
None of us.
And I started making noise about it almost straight away.
Only one ever again.
For behind every actor's performance in this drama is a real person, a real family, a real constituent. Michael Rudkin and his wife Susan for many years ran the post office in the village of Ibstock, a village I know well, where 2 of my children went to nursery.
I'm going to show you how to do this.
And then, right in front of my eyes, he starts changing the sub-postmaster's figures. Excuse me. I've been telling my members for years, no one else has access to their branch accounts.
Mr. Rudkin's visit to Fujitsu was a pivotal moment in both the drama and the real-life quest for the truth.
Ladies and gentlemen, you know what this means. It means they can sneak in behind your back, change your figures, bugger off, and leave with no trace.
Remote access. Well, that makes sense.
But it was also the moment that the Rudkins' lives really fell apart.
They said that was impossible. They said that the branch accounts were totally secure. That's what he told me.
They lied.
The version of events given here by Sean Dooley's Michael Rudkin describes exactly what happened to the real one in 2008.
So I drive home from Fujitsu. The next morning, I wake up and my wife is stood at the foot of our bed and there's an auditor beside her. Your post office is now £44,000 in deficit, says he. Coincidence?
Revenge?
My wife ran the post office when I was away on Federation business. So although I was the sub-postmaster, my poor wife is now a convicted criminal.
It was the start of a 4-year living nightmare for the Rudkins, particularly for Susan, who ran the post office day to day, and on whom suspicion and criminal charges fell.
I'm big enough and ugly enough to look after myself, and have done so. But I also am very protective towards my wife at 5'2", 8 stone. Initially, when this first broke, contemplated suicide. Me and my 2 sons, we had to administer the medication prescribed by a general practitioner because she could potentially have carried out that threat of taking her life, because they absolutely destroyed Susan's character and personality. She was a fun-loving, active woman, outgoing, would think nothing of jumping on a push bike and joining in with the boys, kayaking, canoeing. She used to be a horse rider. Now, as things stand, yeah, the stature's still the same, but psychologically she's not the same person. To go through that court procedure, to almost pass out in the dock, to be then told she would have a 12-month suspended sentence for 2 years. She would have a 6-month electronic tag. She would have 300 hours of community service to do. And ironically, it was in a charity shop as a cash handler. And this is a woman who's accused of stealing money.
Michael and Susan Rudkin brought their story to one of the very first surgeries I ever held following my initial election victory in 2010. I could scarcely believe what they were saying, but believe it, I did. And they now feel that constituency surgery was at least the beginning of the end of their ordeal.
Susan and I was, over that 4-year period, were full of despair and despondency. We thought our world had fallen apart. I think Andrew himself initially was quite surprised, but I was equally surprised with the speed at which Andrew then came back to me for another surgery and said, would you attend? He'd made some preliminary investigative work and found that the complaint that I was making had some justification. Suddenly to get somebody in your local MP who understood how you were feeling, but more importantly believed in you. You weren't there as somebody that was representing untruths. He could see potentially that there was some truth in the arguments that we were putting forward. He investigated them. he came back promptly and said, there is a case to be answered and I'm here to support you.
To give some background to how the Post Office have let down both the sub-postmasters and indeed members of this House throughout this process.
And it wasn't until Andrew got up in Parliament and started to make an issue out of this, and the fact that then other MPs started to think, hang on a minute, I've just had one of my constituency members complain of something similar.
Postmasters attempted to balance their accounts at the end of the day. From that period forward, there have been failing...
And 550 of us went to court under a group litigation order, which only 1 or 2 of these is issued a year. So that gives some indication of the magnitude and the success that the pressure that our MPs, and in particular Andrew being at the forefront of this, brought about the changes that was necessary for this industry.
This has been the result of many years' work to achieve justice for over...
Before there was no future. People. Susan and I would have been dead and buried. We'd have been just another casualty, forced out of the industry, had our property confiscated. Having talked to Andrew, been to several of his surgeries, then there was a future. There was some prospects at the end of this. Because the confiscation order the Post Office had got in place then had to be lifted and removed so that we could get on with our lives, and we've retained the property.
For many, many months, Fujitsu claimed that Mr. Rudkin had never been on the premises. I told them that Mr. Rudkin claims he signed the visitors book on that day, and helpfully Fujitsu said that they'd lost the visitors book for the day in question. Eventually, a whistleblower came forward from Fujitsu, one of the IT engineers, and he verified everything that Michael Rudkin had said. Ron Warmington was the forensic accountant I recommended to the government to investigate with a view to administering a mediation scheme for the victims. He says the relationship that he and I built was central to his work and getting to the truth.
Andrew brought to the chamber of the House of Commons a business instinct which seemed to be lacking in so many others. He had that sort of awareness of human frailty and of wrongdoing that meant he and I were on the same wavelength. He understood what I was doing and I understood what he was asking.
The House should know that the Post Office has always maintained that it is not possible to alter accounts in a sub-post office remotely. However, recently...
What Michael was reporting was a pivotally important matter.
My member's been losing money.
Oh, the bottom line.
Me included.
Meet your friendly covert operations team.
I get in there.
It turned out to be hugely important. The whole business of Fujitsu meddling routinely, perhaps even on an industrial scale each night, altering branch accounts to correct errors that had come up through the system itself. Andrew got that, he understood that issue. He understood that when we said, of course a company like Fujitsu is going to have a backdoor into the system, because systems, databases, do sometimes accumulate errors and they need to be corrected. Now, what we didn't know at that time, but Andrew was very, very quick on the uptake in understanding, was that not only was that likely to be happening, but it had been happening. What was worse was that, and this was completely outrageous, was that those alterations were being made without the knowledge or permission of the impacted sub-postmasters, and often using their IDs and passwords.
You're inside some sub-postmaster's horizon and he doesn't know. I said, yeah. Yeah, I am.
Now, Andrew had that sort of business acumen that he could get that straight away. And what was, in a sense, frustrating was that he would get it straight away, so would James, or for that matter, Mike would. Post Office, on the other hand, would look at me as though I'd dropped down from Klingon or something like that and was talking in some foreign language. They just didn't understand it and would come up with weasel-worded answers. So when I asked the question, has Post Office or any of its subcontractors, such as Fujitsu, ever altered any branch's account without the knowledge or permission of the impacted sub-postmaster? And that's verbatim the question, verbally and put in writing. And then the answer would come back, there is no functionality in the Horizon system to remotely access branch terminals. People like Andrew and I would go into orbit because they aren't corrected through the front-end system, in this case Horizon. They are corrected with very powerful software that goes right into the database. It's a weasel-worded answer that is probably true, in fact that is true, but it's so monstrously deceptive that it's actually a lie. Now Andrew got that stuff, and God bless him for doing that, and he stuck with it. He didn't quit.
Post Office Limited then started proceedings against Mr. Rudkin's wife for theft
He
and false accounting. They also
not only
for a confiscation order
ferociously represented the Rudkins throughout, he saw the bigger picture, much bigger picture, that there were many, many more people impacted, and he understood the consequences.
Why? Well, because the government...
My part has been written out of this drama. I don't think any of us are surprised by that. But what ITV have also written out is its own refusal to tell this story when the broadcaster was first told about it, by me, in 2014. Its chief executive at the time was Adam Crozier, who at the height of the scandal was in charge of Royal Mail, of which the Post Office was then part. ITV doesn't mention its old boss in the drama series either.
Paula, why don't you make those files available? What's the problem?
The only boss they talk about is Paula Venables, who replaced Crozier in 2010, after most of the Horizon damage had sadly already been done.
I wanted to get this out in the open. It was a government cover-up, and I wanted those innocent people to be vindicated. I went to the BBC, to ITV, to Sky, to Channel 4 News. I went to the Times, I went to the Telegraph, I went to the Daily Mail. I did actually get an article in the Sunday Express. Caroline Wheeler was the political editor of the Sunday Express at the time, and we did a small article about it, which is all we could get in, about this huge miscarriage of justice. Caroline subsequently moved to the Times, the Sunday Times, and I was expecting, we were all optimistic that now she was at a broadsheet newspaper, the newspaper of record, that we'd be able to expose this great injustice. But the fact is, when Caroline Wheeler went to the Sunday Times, her ability to get that story out disappeared with her move. What we're having is suppression of the media, of certain stories. Certainly for at least 5 years, I pressed the media to expose this injustice around the Horizon system, and every one of them refused to ever run the story. That might strike some chords with the current mainstream media's unwillingness to report on vaccine harms, vaccine deaths, or even the excess deaths, or the WHO treaty and the amendments to the international health regulations.
You have to wonder, Madam Deputy Speaker, if this organisation, the Post Office, is even aware of the misery it has caused. The fact that the Post
I've been on my feet in the chamber of the House of Commons for many years, talking about this toxic blend of corporate greed and governmental and regulatory bungling that led to the victimisation of thousands of innocent people.
It only serves to show to me that this organisation is not fit to conduct an inquiry into this matter.
No one seems to care. I fear history will not judge this House kindly. Worse still, in a country supposedly committed to free and frank exchange of views, it appears that no one cares that no one cares. Well, I care, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And
I'm still on my feet today in that chamber. Different issue, different government, different greedy corporations. But in my view, absolutely the same dynamic.
More than 20 rejections to be allowed to raise this topic, but at last we're here to discuss the number of people dying.
The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Well, in Alan Bates, as in Andrew Bridgen, came together with other fellow MPs. Those are the good men that did something. I'm extremely disappointed in government in relation to where Andrew finds himself today. To have accusations levelled against you, and I know what that's all about, when you have these false allegations levelled against you that you're misrepresenting something, when in actual fact you're not misrepresenting, you're making comparisons in terms of numbers, then it's disgraceful and shameful that this particular government, the Conservative Party, have adopted that attitude. I try not to take a political stance because I have voted for both Labour and for Conservatives, but I also believe that sometimes we have to take the politics out of this and we have to say, can I trust that man to deliver for the local community? And as is the case with Andrew Bridgen, yes, I can trust him. And I will go on record as saying, yes, I would vote for him.
What we're seeing, even for the over 85-year-olds, according to the Office of Health Improvement and Disparities.
As to the situation with Andrew and the COVID situation and his being cast adrift by the Conservative Party and speaking to an all but empty House, I find it utterly disgraceful. Whether he's right or wrong, and I personally think he's right, but whether he's right or wrong, we, the populace, elect MPs to represent us and to debate properly, thoroughly, to the point of reaching the truth, matters of consequence. And if this is not a matter of consequence, I don't know what the hell is. The possibility, some would argue the probability, others would argue the proved certainty, that certain pharmaceutical businesses have inadequately tested stuff that we've got floating around in our bloodstream now, and that there have been excess deaths and there have been horrible health consequences for a lot of people, and that subjecting young, tiny children who wouldn't have suffered adverse consequences from COVID at all to having to be immunised or to receive jabs. Of course that should be questioned. Of course it should be debated properly by a full House. When we, the population, see the full House there to debate MPs' expenses and salaries, and 7 or 8 people to listen to Andrew, who's a highly articulate chap, I think it's utterly disgraceful. And 10 out of 10 for him, to Andrew, for sticking to his guns and, you know, what is clearly huge personal cost campaigning on this. I mean, I raise my hat to the man.
You know, we've waited so long for this day, and
it took well over a decade for ITV, the rest of the legacy media, and the government to get their act together on the subject of the sub-postmaster's Horizon scandal.
I mean, look at us. Do we look like criminals?
When it comes to vaccine harms and excess deaths, I tell you this now, we don't have a decade. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you. Just to finish off and bring you up to date with the Horizon system. The full story is that the Horizon software system was developed in the late 90s under Tony Blair. They spent 800 million of your pounds in the late 90s developing the Horizon system. It was originally going to be to pay over benefits from the post office, housing benefit, pensions, child benefit, etc. The fact is they could never make it work. It was so full of glitches. And they didn't want to write the money off. So they thought they'd just wrap it up in a retail package and give it to the sub-postmasters because they couldn't complain about it. Tony Blair knew, as the Prime Minister, when it was introduced in 1998, he was asked in the chamber, it's in Hansard, are you sure that this is a robust system? And he said it was Rolls-Royce and perfect. He knew it wasn't. That was a lie at the dispatch box. And every politician of every colour had covered that up and let
over 1,000 people get criminally prosecuted. Many of them went to prison on the basis of a known dodgy computer system. They were just the collateral damage. As I say, I believe that it was covered up by the Conservative government because they wanted to sell off the Post Office and Royal Mail. Unfortunately, they ended up only being able to sell off Royal Mail, didn't they? Yeah. As far as Susan Rudkin goes, I got her case. Her criminal conviction was overturned. She was one of the first 9 of the 1,000, and her criminal conviction was overturned in December 2020. But what I can tell you, I spoke to Mr. and Mrs. Rudkin only a few weeks ago. They never had their compensation. No, and the government had said, "Oh, we're going to turn over these convictions because they're not being." The law was, you had to have your conviction overturned before you could claim the compensation, and the judiciary have to do that. The separation of powers between the legislature and the judiciary. Because it was going, I think 88, a year or so ago, only 88 of the 1,000 had had their convictions overturned. They were all unsafe. So it was decided for the first time ever, Parliament would pass an act and overturn all of those convictions based on Horizon evidence because it was a faulty system. And they said that is what's holding back the compensation. Well, that wasn't what was holding back Mr. and Mrs. Rudkin's compensation, was it? Because I got them turned over in December 2020. They're still waiting for their compensation. Just like the Longcliffe report a few weeks before Rishi Sunak called the general election into the infected blood scandal, which had gone on for, I'd represented one of my constituents in the north of the constituency for more than a decade on the infected blood scandal. He had some dodgy blood from the NHS, he got hepatitis B, he's dying, and he's never had his compensation. They will wait until these people die and they'll do a deal with their relatives and it'll be a few £100,000 and they'll take it. And that is the way it works again and again and again. I also exposed the modern slavery in the fast fashion industry in Leicester. Leicester's not in my constituency, it's 15 miles from my constituency, but people from Leicester came to see me because they knew it was no good going to their own representatives, either councillors or MPs, because everybody in Leicester knew that there was probably 10,000 people working in sweatshops being paid £3, £3.50 an hour, some £2.50 an hour, working in appalling conditions, making clothes which were fed into the fast fashion industry. That would be your Boohoo, I Saw It First, Pretty Little Thing. When I raised that issue, Boohoo's share price was £4.50, dropped to about 36p. The government didn't deal with it properly, but the market sorted that one out. And we actually had a situation where a lawsuit was going through in America to ban a UK-based company, Boohoo, from exporting its products to America because its products were being made under slave labour conditions in the UK. How embarrassing was that? Yeah? So, I'd been a bit of a pain in the backside to the government, and I fell for the scam on COVID to start with. MPs, we were locked down in our constituencies, just like you were. Some people say there was no virus. I'm willing to agree, looking back now, it is not as easy, and it's a lot of fear porn out there, that they'll say that in these biolabs they're creating these killer diseases they're going to unleash on us. We're not as easy to kill as they think, or they thought, they'd hoped. Our immune systems are pretty amazing things. But I think there was something, because I've never personally had an illness. I've never had an illness where I'd required a day off work. I've never had an illness where I'd not gone home early in the afternoon not feeling very well, but not felt better the next morning and gone to work. That never happened in my life. Never had flu. In early March 2020, I had something which knocked me off my feet, and I was getting worse day after day after day, and I lost my sense of taste and smell. Before, it can't be psychosomatic because that wasn't even acknowledged as a symptom in those days. So I had something early on. So, but I took, unfortunately, 2 AstraZeneca vaccines, and I must say my gut was telling me run away, and I should have listened to it. But I looked at the way the government were answering questions. I looked at the way scientists were being treated who raised legitimate questions. And also, when the government or anybody else says to you the science is settled, I mean, it should set a red flag straight away, because one thing about science is it's never settled. There is always, you know, if it needs to be defended, it needs to be, you've got to be able to defend it. Even medical students who qualify this week, they will be told at the end of their 5-year course that half of what they've learnt will be proved within 10 years to be wrong. They have to retrain and keep up to date and keep their knowledge up to date. So science is always evolving, it's never settled, it should always be up for challenge. And when we were seeing respected scientists, leaders in their field, asking very legitimate questions about the pandemic response, the lockdowns, the masking, the social distancing, and the vaccines, the so-called vaccines, then the alarm bells started to ring. When we got round to December 21, I was monitoring what was going on in South Africa and speaking to South African scientists and doctors about the emergence of the Omicron variant. And it was coming back to Parliament in December, it was very clear to me that the government were intending on trying to lock us down again for Christmas. What I'd seen during the lockdowns in North West Leicestershire is that the happiest seat in the place to live in the Midlands. I see people who'd worked really hard, losing their businesses, self-employed people having no support whatsoever, and the suicide rate in the happiest place to live in the Midlands, I was having more people committing suicide in a month than we normally had in a year. And when I wrote to the government about it, they said there was no link at all between suicide rates and lockdowns. Perhaps they'll have another explanation for the million under 25s at the end of the lockdowns that were on waiting lists for mental health support. And speaking to the South Africans and using what I thought was my accumulated knowledge, I could see that there was no justification for a further lockdown because the Omicron variant. Now, the original Wuhan strain apparently had an R rate of 3. The R rate is the transmission rate. R8 of 3 meant that for every person who got the original Wuhan strain, you gave it to 3 people. Well, I was told that from South Africa, the R rate of the Omicron variant was 12. So for everyone who got it, it was much more contagious, but far less dangerous. Well, I mean, if we couldn't contain the original Wuhan strain at 3 with lockdowns and everything, so what would we do with something that was 4 times more contagious, i.e. much easier to transmit? So the lockdowns would have been completely ineffective, devastate the economy, another round of depression, mental health problems and suicide, the last thing we wanted. And with that in mind, I was pretty shocked the first week in December in 2021 when I got an invite to go to a party in number 10, which, yeah, you've got hindsight, you see. And the Partygate stuff hadn't come out, and I saw that, and I wrote back to the Prime Minister's office and said, oh, it's Boris Johnson, and said, I think you're going to have plans to try and lock my constituents down again this Christmas. I'm not going to vote for it. I'm going to speak against it. I'm going to vote against it. And if you are going to do that, I think it'd be completely inappropriate. Only a week or 2 before, you want me to go to a social drinks party in number 10. Because if it's that serious, we shouldn't be doing it. Nothing back. And the week after, I got invited to another party at number 10, even though I'd refused the week before. And by this time, it was apparent that the government were planning on another lockdown for Christmas. So I wrote back again saying, you know, I told you last week I wouldn't come to a party. I thought you were going to try and lock us down and take the freedoms of my constituents away again, which I will oppose. And now I find you are going to try and do that, and I will oppose it. So it can't be right for me to come for a social gathering in number 10, a drinks party, if you're contemplating, if it's that serious, you're going to take away the freedom of my constituents. And of course, the week after that, so rounds of parties at number 10. This is how politics works, you see, they're so cynical. Then the Partygate scandal broke, and didn't you realise they were just trying to get everyone's hands in the blood? That you'd all been to parties at number 10, yeah, because they knew it was going to come out, it was going to break. And of course, that showed you that those people at the very heart of government who had access to the latest science, the latest data, they weren't implementing the same restrictions they were placing on everybody else. They weren't worried about killing Granny. You know, they were having parties. In fact, I got to see a civil servant who was diligent and had written an email to his boss during the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns, and he actually said, don't you think we ought to implement, you know, social distancing and masking inside number 10 when we're inflicting this on the country? And his boss wrote back to him very helpfully with an email saying, well, we spoke to the scientists and none of it works. But when you leave the building, could you please put your mask on and socially distance, because we've got TV cameras outside. Yeah? And how do you think that made me feel? You know, I'm feeling like we've all been taken for a ride here. So I voted against everything that December, the masking, the lockdown, the mandates on the NHS, and the government phased it back a bit because I think 80 odd people rebelled against the government, but they'd done the damage. They'd scared the public enough that it ruined another Christmas for everyone, and it was completely unnecessary. And so the first week in January, I wrote a full page in the Telegraph, which you can go and, I think it was the 11th of January. I wrote a full page in the Telegraph saying why Boris Johnson has got to go as Prime Minister. And it was basically because he'd lied to us and damaged the nation unnecessarily during the COVID pandemic for something that they, you know. I'm not thinking that now. If you look back, do you really think that Boris Johnson was at death's door with COVID-19? Do you think if the Prime Minister had actually, you know, got this terrible disease and been taken to hospital and was going to, you know, in danger of his life, would he allow those people in number 10 not to take reasonable precautions against the disease? Of course he wouldn't. Boris Johnson would have loved that bit of theatre. Yeah, a week off. Yeah. And it's very interesting that, you know, he showed two NHS staff who looked after him all the time he was in there for a week, just two. Turns out they were both non-UK nationals and neither of them are in the NHS now.
And yet they
Disappeared. And the chances of that happening is nil. So none of it adds up. And I wrote that, and then I got a call from number 10, and someone came to see me, a very, very senior civil servant, in fact an advisor, a special advisor, a SPAD, number 3 at number 10. He worked for Crosby Textor, the polling and election gurus, and he said, Andrew, what do you want to shut up? I said, what do you mean? He said, we can give you anything you want. You can have anything you want, just tell us what you want, we're getting you. And I said, well, anything I want? I said, yeah. I said, is that the game we're playing? And they said, yes, that's the game we're playing. I said, right. I said, well, in that case, that's the game we're playing. I better have the Prime Minister's resignation, that's right, I. And they said, I couldn't have that. And I said, well, I don't want anything else. And that was an eye-opener. And I've actually got the text messages as well to prove all that. And really, from that moment on, it was pretty much war. And I knew, when I spoke out about the vaccines, I knew there was going to be a big backlash. And I didn't want to do it for nothing. I could have done it earlier. But when the MHRA, the Medicines Healthcare Product Regulatory Agency, wanted to vaccinate children, little children, under 5 down to the age of 6 months, as they have done most of the rest of the world, no healthy child of that age has died of COVID, even with all the jiggery-pokery around all of that. We already knew from the Fryman papers that even looking at Pfizer and Moderna's original test documentation, that on average 1 in 800 people who took the vaccines are going to have a serious adverse event, which includes death, a life-changing injury inflicted on children who are at no risk from the virus. And we can't live in a society where we ask small children, I don't expect to live in a society where you ask small children to make sacrifices for us. I expect to make sacrifices for them. Any society where you're willing to sacrifice young children to keep yourself alive, that is sick before we even start. And I knew that even the most pro-vax people, I could persuade them that there was no case for vaccinating these small children. And I went round my colleagues in the House of Commons, I went to all my old Brexit mates, Brexiteers, people I trusted, and I was just shocked. Some of them said, yeah, I think you're right, Andrew. There's something wrong with these vaccines. This is back in November 2022. I think there's something wrong with these vaccines, but I don't want to get involved in any campaigning about it. Another one of my very senior colleagues, a man who's very famous and you would recognise him, you'd all know him, know his name. He admitted to me that he'd had 2 Pfizers, this is November 22, he'd had 2 Pfizers, gone down to the gym, felt ill, had a massive chest pains, had to go to hospital, and they said he'd had 2 heart attacks. And told him if he wasn't as fit as he was, he'd be dead. And I said, well, I'm very sorry to hear that, but he said, no, I'm not speaking out about them. Another colleague came to me and she told me that I was right about the vaccines, that her sister had taken a Moderna booster and was paralysed from the neck down. And I said, I'm really sorry to hear about your sister, but now you've got to speak out. You've got a duty of care to your constituents. You know the truth. You've got to speak. And she said, well, my sister's a nurse, you see, and she was coerced by the NHS into taking it. She didn't really want it. I said, and now she's paralysed from the neck down. She's completely at the mercy of the NHS. She said, and Andrew said, you know what the NHS are like with whistleblowers, don't you? I said, I do. I said, but you haven't got to mention your sister. You've got 100,000 constituents, just like I have. You have lots of emails in there about vaccine harms, and you don't have to mention your sister. And she turned around and said to me, I'm not talking about it. I'm not going to speak out. And she just walked off. They knew. That's why they couldn't wait to get out the door fast enough when we had the debates. Pretend that, stick your fingers in your ears, go la la la, and pretend that I don't know anything about it. And also, why do you think so many MPs stood down at the last election? Yeah? Because they are worried that retribution is coming. So, I spoke out on the 13th of December 2022, got that debate on the safety and efficacy of the vaccines, and although the government will say it didn't, I was talking rubbish, what I can assure you is the government never dared authorise those vaccines for under 5s in this country. They did in 99% of all the other countries in the world. They didn't dare. And my life changed on the 13th of December 2022, because from that moment onwards, I was cancelled by the mainstream media. I was ostracised by my colleagues. No one wanted to talk to me. I spent from then until the next generation in June 2024, I had to eat every meal on my own in Parliament. That's how petty and bullying it is. And thank goodness there are 4,000 real people who work in Parliament, the cooks and the cleaners The waiters, the security guards, the clerks, the repairmen, and 80% of them were with me. And it was amazing that in those dark days, speaking about the vaccines, standing up on my own in Parliament, in the chamber, in that horrible place, walking out of there late at night sometimes, it was amazing when there would be one of the cleaners, and most of them are black ladies in Parliament. I'd be coming down this corridor and she'd be there with her trolley, cleaning trolley, mopping the floor, and as I walked by, she'd look up and down, make sure there's no one about, and she'd jump out and grab me and go, "Andrew, we're all praying for you." What can you say? I mean, unbelievable. And as far as going to the staff canteen was concerned, I used to have to not go there because they used to pile the plate up that much on mine. It used to be embarrassing, you know. So they were doing me a favour. So the people knew. The people knew. And I was shocked at the end. Obviously, I got suspended for a spurious tweet, which is in no way anti-Semitic, and Mr. Hancock will get sorted on that eventually, 3 years in. And I ended up going to see a grandee of the Conservative Party. He gave me a few days' notice. He'd obviously had the consultation with the party centrally. And after an hour and a half of talking to him about the vaccines, and also I checked him out, and he didn't know that I knew that his own sister had had to go to hospital with chest pains after her second Pfizer jab. So he knew. He played dumb. An hour and a half in his office, just me and him. I talked about all the science around, concerns around the safety and efficacy of the vaccines. I also talked about NG 163, NICE guideline 163, which was brought in by Matt Hancock on the 4th of April 2020 as a treatment for people, vulnerable elderly suffering with COVID-19 suspected. When that was to be prescribed midazolam and morphine. Well, unfortunately, when people were told with a dodgy PCR test that you've got COVID, there was only a 2-track, they were then told to stay at home until your lips go blue, no early treatment, and then come into hospital, and you're basically just a binary choice. You're either going to be put on a ventilator with an 85% chance of dying, or if you weren't thought to be strong enough for that, you were vulnerable elderly, you were just put on a death pathway of midazolam and morphine, where midazolam and morphine are both respiratory suppressants. Why would you give a respiratory suppressant to someone who's supposedly suffering from a respiratory virus and was having trouble breathing? But that's what we did. That's what we did. And NG 163 was in for about 18 months. It was replaced by NG 191, superseded by NG 191. NG 163 is actually the Liverpool care pathway, something that we voted in Parliament in 2014 to remove. It's being inhuman. It was brought back in for those vulnerable elderly. And I fear, very much fear, that tens and tens of thousands, probably 35 or 40,000 vulnerable elderly were moved out of hospitals in early 2020 into care homes. Most of them were moved out, they were in hospital for a reason, they needed treatment. They were moved out without their medication, but they were sent with NG 163. They were euthanized, and they were all would have died breathlessly, and they would all have been put down on the death certificate as COVID-19. And I asked a written question to the government several years ago, and the question was in writing: how many vulnerable elderly were moved out of hospital in March, April 2020 to make way for the expected first wave of COVID patients? And they never came, by the way. They never came. The hospitals were empty. And how many of those vulnerable elderly had died within 7, 14, 21, 28 days 56 days, 72 days of, on their death certificate, COVID-19, B, other causes. And the government wrote back and said, we don't hold any of that data. Well, they're telling me they didn't know how many vulnerable elderly were moved out of hospital, and they didn't know what had happened to any of them. Well, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, I did some research, and I do know what happened to them. And I believe they were euthanised. And I explained all this to my Conservative grandee as well. And after an hour and a half, I said to him, where do we go from here? And his response to me was, Andrew, this is in January 2023, there is currently no political appetite for your views on the vaccines. There may be in 20 years' time, and you're probably going to be proven right then, but in the meantime, you need to bear in mind, you're taking on the most powerful vested interest in the world with all the personal risk for you which that will entail. And I said, well, I think this meeting's over, isn't it? I walked out of the Conservative Party. And I've never spoken to that man again, and he never looked me in the eye again. Because I'll tell you now, I know that he has sold his soul to the devil. Right. And I was trying to get a debate on excess deaths, as well as raising questions about the vaccines. And we, after a pandemic, when you've had a time of excess deaths, it's just purely statistics that you're going to have a time of less than expected deaths. If we have a disaster and a lot of people die prematurely, people who might have lived 6 months, 12 months, 18 months longer, if they passed earlier, sadly, they can't die later. But what we had with this so-called COVID-19 pandemic was, we'd had excess deaths, and the excess deaths had just continued after the pandemic was over. When were the excess deaths? When were we going to have the deficit and expected deaths? Well, we were getting 1,500, 2,000 excess deaths a week, long after the pandemic was over. What was causing it? No one was asking these questions. In Parliament, you're allowed to put in for a debate every week, only on a sitting week. And I put in for a debate on excess deaths every week. And every week it came back unsuccessful in ballot. Unsuccessful in ballot every week. Ladies and gentlemen, you can see why I don't play the lottery, can't you? I'm not very lucky. And 26 weeks, that's 6 months. With the recess time, that was 9 months I'd put in every week for a debate on excess deaths. But just unlucky. So what I did then, in the summer of 2023, I did some research. I researched into what happened with thalidomide. And thalidomide was a drug brought in by a company called Grünenthal. It's a German company. Grünenthal was formed after the Second World War, and the scientists they used, a lot of them were former Nazis, including their chief scientist, a guy called by the name of Heinrich Munker, charming gentleman who was indicted for war crimes against the Poles at the end of the war, but wasn't convicted. And he became the lead scientist for Grünenthal, and he developed thalidomide, a drug to treat nausea, and which was prescribed for women with morning sickness. And its selling point was that you couldn't overdose on it, so you could take as much as you wanted. And what they didn't know is that thalidomide crossed the blood placenta barrier, went into the fetus, and it prevented angiogenesis. Angiogenesis is the formation of blood vessels. Depending on the development of the fetus and the amount of drug that the mother took was the amount of disability that the fetus would suffer. 40% of the babies died and 60% were born with horrific, life-changing deformities, very short arms and legs because the limbs couldn't develop because the mothers were taking thalidomide. The drug was actually only introduced in 1958 and it was withdrawn in 1961 with the concerns. Although it was withdrawn in 1961. The word thalidomide was never mentioned in the Chamber of the House of Commons until 1972. They put a block on it. Grunethal had an injunction against the Times newspaper not to be able to run stories about children who were born with thalidomide disabilities. That was ruled illegal by the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights, and 3 judges there, I've got a copy of the judgment, it said that successive speakers of the House of Commons had deliberately suppressed all debate and questions on thalidomide for 11 years. And I made a little video about thalidomide in the summer of 2023. And I'm going to play that for you now. And I sent that at the end of the summer, to our current Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle. And the message I sent with it is, Lindsay, we don't want history to repeat itself, do we? And he found me a debate within 3 weeks, after 26 weeks of refusal.
Hello, I'm Andrew Bridgen. I'm the Reclaims Member of Parliament for North West Leicestershire. You may have noticed I've been making some noise in the place behind me lately about a novel medical procedure, a product that was given to a large number of people, myself included, which seems increasingly likely has caused more health problems than it's solved. Despite my best efforts, nobody in this building behind me has been willing to discuss this vital issue in any meaningful sense. The few debates I have managed to arrange have been sparsely attended, ignored by most of your elected representatives. But this is not the first time Parliament has suppressed discussion of a disastrous drug rollout. We all think we know the story of thalidomide, how a miracle cure for morning sickness became one of the largest man-made medical catastrophes in history. But perhaps you don't know the dark origin story of this company that created the catastrophe. Chemie Grunethal, the German pharmaceutical company behind the infamous drug thalidomide, has been subject to investigations regarding its alleged connections to the Nazi regime. Although these allegations may not be fully substantiated, there's considerable evidence linking the firm to former Nazi Party members. Founded in the aftermath of World War II by Hermann Wirtz, Grunethal initially operated in a devastated post-war Germany. The company hired a number of scientists who were reportedly associated with the Nazi Party during the war. Among them was Dr. Heinrich Muchter, who served as the company's chief scientist. Muchter had previously worked on anti-typhus efforts in Poland during the Nazi occupation. And although he was investigated for war crimes post-war, he was never convicted. Under Muchter's leadership, Grunethal developed and marketed thalidomide. Even before thalidomide's release to the public, it was given out free to staff, and the wife of an employee of the company gave birth to a baby without any ears. But the company, Grunethal, covered this up and moved on to marketing. Within 2 years, it's estimated that over 1 million West Germans were taking the drug on a daily basis. The first alarm bell sounded not from the pages of a medical journal, but from the sharp observations of a vigilant nurse, Sister Pat Sparrow. Night after night, Sister Sparrow, a nurse at Sydney's Crown Street Women's Hospital, was disturbed by an eerie pattern. Newborns, mostly from the practice of one Dr. William McBride, were being born with grievous limb deformities. Her heart ached for those innocent lives, their futures marred by the echoes of a silent epidemic. Amid the fear and confusion, one correlation emerged in her mind: thalidomide. Dr. McBride, unlike his peers, had recently begun prescribing this new miracle drug to alleviate the agonies of morning sickness. In a world that often overlooked the insights of nurses, Sparrow faced an uphill battle. Her initial warnings were met with scepticism and perhaps disbelief from Dr. McBride. But relentless in her pursuit of the truth, Sister Sparrow did not back down. The veil of doubt began to lift. Eventually, Dr. McBride could no longer deny the monstrous reality. Thalidomide the supposed saviour of expectant mothers, imparted a lifetime of suffering and death to their children. After McBride published an article in The Lancet in 1961, Grunethal withdrew thalidomide from the German market. Distillers, the British distributor, followed suit. And so began a long fight for justice that continues to this day. As the victims near retirement, their medical needs can only become more complex. In 1979, a battle in this fight was won when the European Court of Human Rights found that an injunction placed on newspaper reporting of the thalidomide tragedy was a free speech violation. But it was what the judge said about the House of Commons in paragraph 13 of the judgment that concerns me today. The Speaker, he said, had repeatedly refused to allow any debate or question on the issues raised by the thalidomide tragedy. Repeatedly. And that is exactly what's going on today, as the questions about the medical intervention that so many of us have taken mount up. And the answers for the injured and the bereaved, they only have each other. So you see, questionable pharmaceuticals and complicit politicians are nothing new.
In 1968, a criminal trial began in Germany of Grunethal and a number of its employees. But there was high-level political interference in this trial from the start. All charges were dropped when the company agreed to set up a compensation fund for the victims. In exchange, they were granted immunity from prosecution. So they bought their way out of trouble with a small fraction of their thalidomide profits. The story in South America demonstrates, though, the utter callous contempt for human life of the pharmaceutical industry. Sales in Brazil, for example, began after adverse events had already been reported in Germany, and thalidomide wasn't withdrawn there until 1962, a year after it was pulled in Europe. Almost immediately, remarkably, thalidomide was back. Approved in several countries, including Brazil, as a treatment for leprosy. And although measures were put in place to try and ensure pregnant women did not take it, these were difficult to enforce. A number of studies have found that thalidomide is still causing birth defects in Brazil up to our times. One in 2016 said new cases of thalidomide embryopathy are still being reported. Another in 2007 highlighted 3 new cases since 2005, but said this was probably underreported. Considering that these 3 cases were not registered through a systemic surveillance system, the authors said, but came to our attention through a series of coincidental random events, it can be assumed that the actual occurrence of affected babies by thalidomide continues to be as frequent as announced 10 years ago. In Spain, the reality, if possible, is even bleaker. The country was, in 1961, still living under Franco's dictatorship. Grunethal claims that thalidomide was withdrawn there at the same time as it was elsewhere, but Spaniards were still being born with clear signs of thalidomide embryopathy until the early 1980s. The company has said this may be due to counterfeit thalidomide being sold in Spain and being beyond their control. But Avite, the group that represents victims in Spain, says different. They have obtained this letter, written, they say, in 1961 by Grunethal to their sister company in Madrid, advising that if they decided not to inform Spanish doctors about what was going on with thalidomide elsewhere, they would have the company's backing. In an interview with the BBC in 2016, Avite said that thalidomide remained on the official drugs register in Spain until 1975, long after Grunethal and the Spanish government knew exactly what that drug was doing to fetuses.
This is the problem with Big Pharma. This is the morals of the people we're dealing with. They have a fiduciary duty to deliver profit for their shareholders. They have no fiduciary duty or obligation to give you, me, or anyone else the correct and safe medication. It was 11 years between the withdrawal of thalidomide and the eventual debate in the House of Commons. I just hope it doesn't take that long this time around. Thank you very much for listening to me.
There is one more, well, several more shocking similarities between thalidomide and the COVID-19 vaccines. The marketing slogan for thalidomide was safe and effective. And following the disastrous thalidomide damage to the public, pharmaceutical companies are banned from using the phrase safe and effective to describe their products without serious caveats. But of course, during the COVID-19 debacle, governments, government officials, medical officers, doctors, TV celebrities, they were the marketing arm of Big Pharma, and they were the ones that described it as safe and effective. Something that Big Pharma were legally not allowed to do themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a break now for about 30 minutes and then we'll carry on. Thank you very much for listening to me.